the elites who run Europe and the foreign policy establishment in the United States are deeply opposed to reaching any sort of accommodation with the Russians. And as you and I both know full well, the Russians are going to win this war. What exactly that victory looks like is hard to say, but the Russians are going to win. They're not going to lose. NATO, and this includes the United States and the Europeans, are not going to be happy about that at all. And you're going to have a fundamentally conflictual relationship, even if it doesn't involve shooting, between the West on one side, allied with Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, and the Russians on the other side. So we're in trouble for as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, I don't doubt that there was genuine assumption, linked to the liberal assumptions about how the relationships would work out. Again, in the liberal theory, they assume that democracy leads to peace, economic interdependence leads to peace, shared institutions lead to peace. So with the economic growth of China, you have the middle class, they demand democracy. Now you have peace, economic interdependence between the US and China, peace. And of course, more integration of China into shared institutions, then also common rules, the anarchy is reduced, also peace. Of course, in the if you look at the world from their realist lens, a stronger China would of course unleash a direct competition between the United States and China. But the same logic also was flawed with Russia, though, that it was the argument that NATO was then just a democratic community. It was no longer aimed to contain Russia. So the Russians shouldn't be concerned. However, as soon as Russia began to push back, it immediately also converted back to the Cold War containment objective, which we now see. So it's, I guess what I'm missing is a bit of in all of the West is some reflection on some of the wrong assumptions which were made, and some course correction, but I haven't really gone there yet. I did want to ask about the Europeans, though, because I can see, how the United States should reposition itself in the international system. That is, accommodate other centers of power. That is, Russia, India, in order for, not to push them too far over to the main adversary. But what do the Europeans do? Because they have been just linked to the United States, intimately so, since World War II. But in a multipolar system, the Americans have less interest in Europe. They have other priorities. The world isn't Eurocentric anymore. So how should the Europeans act? Because the US has been important for the past 80 years. It's been a pacifier within Europe to prevent us from going at each other's throat. But it's also been a very important actor for the Europeans to remain relevant after World War II as well. So what is the pathway? How does Europe, I guess, adjust to a multipolar world? Because bipolarity, we had to be with US. It protected us from the Soviets. The unipolar world order, it was we had a great ambition. The EU was supposed to be collective bargaining power. We're supposed to be the other leg. The collective hegemony of the political West was supposed to be US and Europe, again enduring relevance in the world. But in a multipolar world where the Americans are leaving, and what does the European do? Because we haven't really been, as you said before, in a position like this since before the Second World War.
Yeah, I just want to repeat what you said in slightly different words because it's so important what you said. The Cold War was focused on Europe. For anybody who did the Cold War, the Central Front in Europe was the centerpiece of the conflict. So Europe mattered enormously to the United States during the Cold War. And East Asia took a back seat. And then came unipolarity, and the United States and the Europeans were joined at the hip during unipolarity. We stayed in Europe. As you pointed out, Glenn, we remained the American pacifier. And of course, NATO expansion, if you think about it, just means more American involvement, not less American involvement, because the Americans are now concerned with extending the pacifier over the eastern half of the continent, not just keeping it over the western half. And then unipolarity goes away, as you say, and we're in multipolarity. And the consequences for Europe are enormous. I'm repeating what you said because it's important that viewers just understand what's happened here. Europe just doesn't matter that much for the United States. And let me just say a few words about that. First of all, almost everybody agrees, certainly in the national security establishment here in the United States, that the principal threat the United States faces comes from China. And that necessitates a pivot to Asia, which means a pivot away from Europe. And that's a momentous decision. As I like to tell people, for the entire history of the United States, up until about 2017, Europe was the most important area of the world for us outside of the Western Hemisphere. Europe was always more important than Asia. And that was because the most powerful states in the system, besides the United States, were in Europe, not in East Asia. Nazi Germany was far more of a threat to us than Imperial Japan was. Well, that world has gone away. The principal threat that we face is in East Asia. So East Asia, by definition, is more important to us than Europe is. This is the first time that that's ever happened. And of course, this is what underpins the pivot to Asia. And this is really significant for Europe. Second point I'd make, which is closely related to this, is the third great power in the system is Russia. And despite all this crazy talk in Europe about how Russia's going to conquer all of Ukraine, then conquer Eastern Europe, and pretty soon after that, it's going to be on the beaches of Dunkirk. This is just craziness. This is not going to happen. Russia's having a tough time conquering the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. The idea that this is the second coming of the Wehrmacht, they're going to conquer all of Ukraine and then move further westward, it's just not a serious argument. So there's no reason for the United States to be in Europe from the perspective of great power politics. Should we be in Europe to contain Russia? No, because there's no serious threat that Russia's going to dominate Europe. And in fact, we were foolish to expand NATO past 2004 because we created this crisis, which is not in our national interest. It's dragged us into Europe. In fact, the United States should be pivoting to Asia. So you have this situation where the United States has no real incentive to stay in Europe because East Asia is a much more important theater, and the Chinese there are many Chinese. They have formidable military forces, and the United States is going to need all the help it can get trying to contain China. So staying in Europe does not make a lot of sense. This is disastrous from a European perspective because the United States has served as a pacifier. The Europeans, for good reasons, I don't blame the Europeans at all, don't want us to leave. Because as long as you have Uncle Sam in Europe, NATO is intact, you have the pacifier in place. And nobody has to worry about Germany rearming, right? And nobody has to worry about the Russians because the Americans are there. But you take the Americans away and it's a very different situation because Europe is then on its own, and it quickly becomes apparent that Europe is not a political entity by itself, that Europe is a collection of different states that have all sorts of collective action problems, that have all sorts of different security concerns. If you're Spain, you think about Ukraine very differently than if you're Poland, obviously. And then if you factor in history, relations between countries like Germany and France, Germany and Denmark, and especially Germany and Poland come to the fore. And the United States is not there, to act as a pacifier and solve collective action problems and smooth ruffled feathers. So from a European perspective, the key is to try to keep the Americans in. And that would be tough to do under any circumstances because of the structural imperatives here. The fact that East Asia is so important to the United States, but it's especially tough because Trump is the president, and Trump basically loathes the Europeans. The Europeans, of course, understand this. They don't talk much about it because they understand that you have to constantly kiss up to President Trump and be nice to him and so forth and so on. But they understand that he loathes them, and he would be perfectly happy to put an end to NATO and get out of Europe. So it's going to be very difficult for the Europeans moving forward to keep that pacifier in place.
Well, I think this also explains why the Europeans are, I guess, behaving so different from the rest of the world. Because, well, when the world was bipolar, either you choose one camp or the other, but by marrying one, you also isolate yourself from the other. So it was easier, I guess, to have unity in Europe under the bipolarities. And again, with unipolarity, what I heard as well from the central bank chief of Hungary and others was, well, America was the only game in town. If you wanted to prosper, you would ride this wave. So you went with the US. But a multipolar system, it offers a lot of attraction to many countries around the world, because unlike the bipolar or unipolar, we kind of have to accept who's the boss. In the multipolar system, you can diversify your ties. It's not just great for economic prosperity, but it also gives the opportunity for small and medium-sized countries to have a much greater political autonomy. Look at Turkey. No one can tell them what to do. The bipolar, unipolar order, they had to fall in line. Now, anyone push them too hard, they can have a swing strategy. They can lean to China, US, no one's telling them what to do anymore. So a lot of countries see this attractive. It's just the Europeans, though, they really bet everything on on essentially extending this unipolar moment, and to the extent where they cut their ties with all other centers of power. First the Russians, now the Chinese. You mentioned before Iran, this snapback sanctions. I recently spoke to the previous or former advisor to the Iranian nuclear team, and he was saying, well, this was the only reason we still even listened to the Europeans, is because they had the possibility of doing these sanctions. Now they have no more value for us. There's no more reason to, talk to them. So it's just we're cutting ourselves off from everyone, only the United States, and then hoping that this will be rewarded by the Americans to show our loyalties. But instead, it puts the Europeans in an even more exposed position, because if you only have one partner, as Trump put forward a trade agreement, the Europeans have to sign anything that comes in front of them. All the leaders have to sit nicely on the chairs in front of his desk and call him daddy, as he almost look at them with contempt for being so spineless and unable to stand up for their own national interest. It's there's a feeling that after the Ukraine war, because some Europeans think it's a good idea to only align with the US to strengthen the political West, other believes we have to adjust to multipolarity by diversifying ties. So I guess my question is it only the Ukraine war that's holding the Europeans together in the multipolar world, or do you expect Europe to begin to fragment more once the Ukraine war is over and people will adjust differently to this new distribution of power? Because, as you said, if you're Greece or Latvia, in the multipolar world, there's very little that unites your interest anymore. I mean, surely they would begin to drift apart if you don't have a war to unite you.
Yeah, I think just based on your last comment, I think that one of the reasons that the Europeans want to continue the war in Ukraine and keep the Americans deeply committed to that war is that will keep the American pacifier in Europe. In other words, I think when European elites look at the Ukraine war, they don't just simply think about winning the Ukraine war to contain Russia. I would guess that a number of them understand that Russia's not that great a threat. But what they really want to do is keep the Americans in the fight. And they're doing everything they can to keep the Americans in the fight. And that's because they want to keep the pacifier in place. But it's not clear that they're going to succeed at that. The war is going to end at some point. There are going to be all sorts of recriminations. And the Americans are slowly but steadily moving to pull out of Europe. There's been no one big decision that's made, but in a very incremental way, you can see the United States slowly heading toward the exit. And of course, I think the Europeans understand that. The European leaders understand that, and they're trying to stop the Americans before they get to the exit. They may succeed at that, who knows, but they have a very difficult task. But then, if the Americans do leave, or the Americans greatly reduce their presence and influence in Europe, I think what you're going to see is powerful centrifugal forces come into play. I mean, these are independent states. There's no such thing as Europe as a separate nation state. people have gotten used to talking about Europe as if Europe were a single entity. It's not a single entity. It's comprised of a series of nation states. And what's allowed us to talk about Europe as if it were a single state, and to pretend that the EU is a single state, is the fact that you have this pacifier in place. As I've long argued, NATO underpins the EU. You take NATO away, and I think the EU's future will be much less rosy, because security underpins economy, and the EU is underpinned by NATO. So the Europeans, the different states in Europe, are going to have to think long and hard individually about how they deal with security. And by the way, you see this in terms of how they think about dealing with Ukraine. There's not a lot of agreement in these meetings that Macron and Starmer put together about how to deal with Ukraine moving forward. It's not like everybody wants to ante up troops to station in Ukraine once the shooting stops. Obviously, countries like Britain and France do. Germany seems to be on the fence. Poland is not on the fence. Poland doesn't want to put troops in Ukraine. And I would imagine that, if you look at relations among various states in Eastern Europe over Ukraine, you'll see all sorts of differences. I've read a number of articles on how the Poles and the Hungarians have very bad relations these days, and a lot of it revolves around the Ukraine issue. And, Poland and Hungary are basically frontline states in Eastern Europe. And then, you throw in the French, the British, the Germans, and it's just hard to imagine how you're going to get consensus on important issues moving forward. And again, to repeat ourselves here, this is why the Europeans want the American pacifier. They want the Americans to solve these collective action problems.
Well, I've already taken a lot of your time, but I do want to have one last question though. In the multipolar system, what do you see the role of Russia, or what would be the ideal policy for Russia, assuming, advancing Russian interests, security interests in a multipolar system? Because, again, for me, my initial dream, or still dream, was always to have a common Europe as a source for peace. More or less what was done with the French and Germans after the World War II. I would have liked to see with the Russians and the rest of the Europeans after the Cold War. Again, it would be good for everyone in terms of prosperity. It would also be a powerful pole of power in a multipolar world, because the alternative seems to be the redividing the continent and reviving the Cold War logic makes the Europeans too dependent on the US and makes Russia too dependent on China. So, but on the other hand, I don't see this as being a possibility anymore. Indeed, I wrote a book almost a decade ago with the title Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for Greater Eurasia, when I outlined a economic theory for, essentially a realist economic theory for how they need a balance of dependence, so not put all their eggs in one basket. And I more or less argued that China had to be their main partner, but they also had to not be too dependent on China, so diversify, get the Indians, Iranians, everyone else on board. I ended up getting Putin's advisor on Eurasian integration, Professor Karaganov. I actually had him write the introduction, and I went to work for him in Moscow afterwards. But the irony is, this is not what ideally I would want to see this common European home, which the idealist, I guess, in me was hoping for. But realistically, it looks as if the goal, the main interest for Russia, the best thing for Russia, would simply be to align itself now closer with the Eurasian power. So I was wondering if how you see this. I mean, if you were advising the Russian government today, what would you tell them to do?
Well, I think I agree in large part with you. There are three great powers in the system: China, United States, and Russia. I think from China's point of view, it would be best if Russia was closely aligned with China against the United States. From the United States' point of view, it would be best if Russia was aligned with the United States against China. That raises the question, what is Russia's best position? My view, and I think this is exactly what you were saying, is that Russia doesn't want to be too close to either one of them. It wants to keep its distance. It wants to have very good relations with the West, and it wants to have very good relations with the Chinese. It wants to sit on the fence. That would be the best strategy. And I've talked to people in Moscow. You've obviously talked to many more people there than I have, but I've talked to people in Moscow who say that that is the optimum strategy. And if the United States and China want to get into an intense security competition in East Asia, the best thing the Russians can do is stay away. Don't get involved. And I think that's smart. But it's impossible for the Russians to pursue that policy because of hostility from the West, which has driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. So they have no choice at this point in time but to have closer and closer relations with China. By the way, Glenn, I think if you look at the Indians have historically played this game. They played it during the Cold War. The Indians were very smart. They were, I think the word we used to use was non-aligned, right? They didn't want to align with the Soviet side or with the American side in the Cold War. And if you look at how the Indians are behaving these days, I mean, they were moving towards the United States, but given Trump's recent behavior, as we talked about at the start of the show, they've moved more towards the Chinese. But the Indians are very cagey, they're very sophisticated, and they fully understand you don't want to get too close to the United States, and you don't want to get too close to China. And one final point on this can be married to your point that in a multipolar system, there's just a lot more flexibility, right? In the Cold War, again, if you're in Europe, right, you just didn't have much choice as to which side you aligned with. If you were in Western Europe, you aligned with the United States. If you were in Eastern Europe, you aligned with the Soviet Union. Just not a lot of choice. It was a rather simple world where the two superpowers had huge amounts, of course, of leverage. Yes, there were countries like India that were not aligned, but by and large, you had to pick sides, especially in places like Europe. But that world has gone away. And it's a much more fluid world. And by the way, Glenn, if you go to Europe and you start thinking about what the future looks like what the future looks like for Europe and European countries, let's assume that the American pacifier by and large goes away and the United States loses its leverage in Europe. The question the Europeans then face is how do they deal with China versus how do they deal with the United States? Because from a European point of view, if the Americans are no longer the pacifier, you want to have good relations with the United States moving forward, no question about that. But you also, I would think, want to have good relations with the Chinese, especially economically. You want to trade extensively with the Chinese. I mean, if you think about this war in Ukraine and what it's helped do to European economies, it's really quite stunning. German economy and the European economy more generally over the next 2 years and what we should expect. It is a very dismal picture, to put it mildly. And a lot of this, not all of it by any means, but a lot of it comes from the Ukraine war. I think the Russians, were an important economic ally of Europe, and losing that economic ally has had big costs. Well, moving forward, I think the Europeans, if they're smart, they want to think about, trying to have good economic relations with China as well as the United States. And if anything, if they're smart, they'll go to great relations to restore good economic relations with Russia. It's in their interest. And they'll have the flexibility to do that. Not completely, but they'll have a lot of flexibility if they're not beholden to the pacifier.
Yeah, I always make the point that because we always see this very complicated strategies how to split the Chinese from the Russians, but one doesn't really need to split them. And I think if the hostilities between the West and Russia comes to an end, there will be a natural equilibrium forming. That is, that the Russians don't want excessive dependence on the Chinese either, because this is an asymmetrical interdependence. The Russians will always be more dependent on China than China is on them, and this translates into very unfavorable political influence. So however, this insistence on trying to break the Russians, it just looks like the best thing for the Russians now is to point all their guns to the West as a deterrent, while reorganize all their economic connectivity towards the East. And it's just a disaster. You mentioned the SCOR meeting they now had. They signed the Power of Siberia 2 with the Chinese after 10 years. This is all the Arctic gas, which was supposed to go to Europe and fuel our economies for decades, is now heading to China. I mean, it's such a exercise in self-harm. You try to explain these things to people in Europe that perhaps, or at least advance the argument that perhaps, we should drop this NATO expansion, put an end to the war. But they almost look at you as if you're a traitor. Like they're really stuck, I think, in the unipolar mindset that this is somehow a treason against the liberal hegemony, the priority of liberal democratic values. I don't know. I can't really make sense of the position anymore. But
It's hard to it really is hard to understand. But Glenn, I hadn't thought about this until just a moment ago, listening to you talk. One could argue that if the United States leaves Europe or takes enough of its troops out that it really loses its political leverage over the Europeans, and the Europeans are on their own, they're in a new world. And how they think about the world will change in fundamental ways. When you have the Americans on top of you, right, acting as a pacifier, and you're working overtime to keep the pacifier in place, you're going to adopt a set of policies that are very different, I think, than the policies that you would adopt if the United States was not there. One could argue, I haven't thought this through, but one could argue that if the United States basically pulls out of Europe and in substantial ways or completely, the Europeans would then smell the coffee and they would then move to end the Ukraine war. You can continue to push the Ukraine war as long as you see that as a way of keeping the Americans in, and the Americans are in, and the Americans are paying a lot of the costs. But once the Americans are out and they're not paying the costs, and it's the Europeans who are paying the cost of that war, and their economies are in deep trouble, they'll think differently. And again, it gets back to our discussion of multipolarity, right? We're in a multipolar world now, and the Europeans, who probably don't understand this because the European mindset was established during the bipolar world and the unipolar world. And what you were saying before is we're in a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, it's a different set of structural constraints. So I think one could argue that if the American pacifier goes away, you will see a fundamental change in how European countries, not Europe, because I don't think we'll be able to talk about Europe the way we have up to now. I think European countries will end up behaving quite differently towards Russia and even towards China.